Hello, friends of the forest. Hope everybody's well. Tonight I'm going to be interviewing Luke from the Holistic Survival School in North Carolina. And so I'm really excited to start doing some more informal interviews, talk about skills, foraging, homesteading, revolutionary things of all sorts. So welcome, everybody. I'd like to share a little bit of incense with y'all. So I made a thing. I made my first incense cones using mako powder. And this is actually flat cedar, or though I call it flat cedar. And it's a type of cedar which I harvested with Centehua sage in San Diego, California. So I actually ground it down, mixed it with mako powder, and then I let it dehydrate. So we offer this a little cedar spirit in blessing and prayer for our new endeavor of communicating about these skills with people who are influential, amazing, and wonderful. Also, if you'd like to come on live and do an interview, talk about some things, we can definitely book that. And so I'm really excited to start doing basically skills show and tell. Hey, look, it works. Look, my own incense cone. Blessings to everyone. So what I'd like to do is read Luke's bio. He's going to jump on in a second. So on his website, holisticsurvivalschool.com, which y'all should check out, he's in North Carolina. Luke is a naturalist, teacher, rewilder, mentor, survivalist, and founder of Holistic Survival School. Not to mention he was on Naked and Afraid, which is very fun to watch. Luke has committed his life to mastering and teaching ancestral and indigenous living skills in order to help people find their balance and connection to the natural world. Luke has learned his skills working at Primitive Wilderness Therapy program in the West Desert of Utah. With over 500 days on the trail, Luke has mentored hundreds of people in the wilderness and learned how earth skills teach us vital life lessons. Furthermore, Luke has witnessed firsthand how nature connection helps bring about growth, health, and vitality to everyone's life. So that is a really important theme which we're going to be focusing on, is how can we as a community who knows that nature skills not only enlivens people, but literally heals us on a fundamental soul level. How can we start bridging the gap between all of the individuals out there who are doing this, who have hid in nature, who have learned these hard skills, and come together as a community to start bringing a deeper level of wisdom and knowledge and connection together? So, my phone is not plugged in, so give me a second. One of the things I'll do is invite you to couple books. So this podcast, so to speak, is sponsored by nothing except for ecology. But one of the things I want to share with you is a little bit of book show and tell. So here we have one of my favorite books for forest, for winter tracking. So this is the Field Guide to Tracking Animals in the Snow. This is a really great small book by Forrest, Forrest, believe it or not. And there's a lot of good information on winter tracking, especially when it comes to snow. And then you have another really great book, I love this, by Paul Resendez, which is Tracking and the Art of Seeing. And this really gets into some more tracker school type things about perceptual awareness when it comes to tracking. It's one thing to see tracks and identify the animal of the tracks. It's another thing to actually start predicting the intent of an animal. And so this has a bit of very practical information about animals all across the United States, as well as some of the perceptual and philosophical aspects to tracking. So these are really, of course it's backwards, because why wouldn't Instagram make a backwards picture? So I can't fix that, and that's pretty much what your computer phone does. It makes the image backwards. So Tracking in the Art of Seeing. Another great one, which I got as a gift from Lavender Manor Farms. Of course, it probably says Ranner Chet. Nope. But this actually says On Tyranny. And this is a small book by Timothy Snyder as far as understanding when governments start trying to take over society. So here's Luke. And without further ado, we welcome him. Let's see if this works. Let's see what happens. We're waiting for Luke. What's up, brother?
Hey, how's it going?
It worked. Success.
Yay.
Yeah, nice to see you. Welcome on
Yeah,
our
thanks for having me.
podcast.
Yeah, great to finally almost face-to-face meet you.
Yeah, Yeah, digital face to face. It's the new thing, you know?
It's the coolest thing.
Yeah, it's
It's
the
the coolest incense face-to-face meeting.
post COVID apocalypse
Right.
connection right here. So
Right. The downfall of connection.
yeah, it's a weird society that's now encouraging this digital connection, and of course with the skill set that we're earning and learning, it's so important to have in-person teaching and mentorship. Like, what are you going to do? Teach hand drill through Zoom, you know? And so I've
Yeah.
really resisted it, and I almost resent how our whole society is pushing towards that kind of like, oh, just replace every physical interaction with a Zoom call. So we're trying to do our best with balancing that psychosis.
Oh man, yeah. It's I'm all about embodiment, and I think, over intellectualization is so rampant in our world, and just like living up in our minds, and not actually embodying these skills and knowledge. And so it's kind of terrifying to me as a teacher to think we're going to be even more up here in the future,
Right.
even less in our bodies, even less paying attention to the physical sensations in our
Yeah.
beings that tell us so much information.
Right. It reminds me of course, the band Talking Heads, but also the concept of being a talking head, you know?
Totally.
Like, "Ah, bark, bark, bark."
Yeah,
And
like
that's
in
what's
future.
gotten us sort of so tangled is punditry. You know, now we're all divided up through political jargon and punditry and these people on TV telling us what to think, feel, and believe. And there's nothing like busting your ass, snapping a hand drill in half because you just spent 15 hours trying to make your first call, you know?
Totally.
The
Totally.
humbling life lessons that comes from just being out in nature and
Hmm.
trying.
Yep.
So I'm really excited. I got a bunch of questions for you, and we'll just get to them and
Cool.
see where this goes. You're my first ever inverted podcast guest, so
I'm your first ever.
well, I think so. I've always been trying to do this, and instead of go all to this, you know, other platforms and podcasts and go through Apple and post production, I've
Uh-huh.
just been looking for a more raw form. But of course, this is only Instagram, so then I can't do it on Facebook. Should I do it on Facebook? Do I have to do two?
Right. Right.
Uploading it, and it's just like it's almost like we have an entire television network in our hands. You know, there's 150 employees right here. It would have been, but now how do we kind of utilize this for a sense of connection that is actually not just going to make us all armchair foragers, you know?
Totally.
So speaking of which, I really was curious on, you know, I just actually found some old pictures of my ancestors, and I was looking through my great grandma, who was, you know, sort of a gypsy crystal ball reader, and just remembering how our foundations of our several generations before us either severed our connection to ecology and nature or really fundamentally built that basis. So I'm wondering about if you think of any stories or connection when you're little as far as where got you interested in primitive skills or, you know, the
Mm.
forest or just being in ecology or anything you'd like to share there.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, I think I had many. I was lucky to grow up with a little woods behind my house, and I just remember I was just sharing this with a friend the other day about how my neighbors and my brother and I would all get together in our backyards, and we shared a woods, and we would basically recreate society where we would have moments where we'd be warring with each other, and we'd have forts and homes and like, this is our line, and we'd war. But then the really beautiful thing is we would also declare peace, and we would have a big feast together, and we'd all collect like corn cobs and rocks and pretend it's food, and like come together. So my childhood was definitely like barefoot in the woods. I was very lucky to have that. Um, but I think, my grandpa was a big sportsman. My grandpa was a big hunter and fisherman, and so was my dad. And that's really, I think, what got me in the woods most of the time. I was going fishing, going camping. Um, but really, the most like the one that's kind of like ingrained in my psyche, I feel like, was my dad was a teacher, so every summer he'd have the whole summer off, and we'd go up to very northern Ontario, not like north, but basically where the roads end in Ontario. So even from Michigan, when I was a kid, it was like a 16-hour drive north or something crazy, and we would just go to this chain of lakes and fish, and we would have to keep our fish like pretty close because bears would come and eat it, and there were ospreys and eagles, and just like I just remember, like, I mean, we were so far out there, we were hours from any town, and I remember just like feeling that, what that did to my body. Like I remember, like, oh my God, well, what if we got hurt? And what if we, and my dad would be like, well, we'll just have to figure it out, and yeah, and it was just like pure wilderness up there. What felt like it was untouched, and now as I return, I'm like, oh no, this has still been, touched by human hands, but still, that definitely set me up for just craving intense wilderness situations from doing that basically every summer when I was a kid. Um, yeah, so I think that really got me going, and then hunting, to an extent. I didn't hunt a ton, because I played a lot of sports growing up. That was kind of my escape, and but yeah, fishing and hunting were kind of the fundamental ways to get me out in the woods and playing with critters. Really, animals have always been my entryway into nature, and yeah, so kind of that interesting note of hunting as a way of connection to the thing you might be killing. So
Yeah, that's a big topic I think is really important, is understanding the ethical hunting aspects. And so I'm wondering, as a younger person, what do you remember sort of seeing die first, or what was your first
mm,
experience of death of an animal? And do you remember if that affected you, or if it felt normal, or what that process was like?
yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I remember my first death.
Yeah.
I remember, or at least my first witnessing death. I remember my dad coming home from hunts, with pheasant and rabbits, and I remember I was just like completely obsessed with the dead animals. I would just be like sitting there watching him skin it and like asking questions about the blood, and just like, whoa, like, does this hurt him now? And like, I remember that pretty vividly, and my dad being a pretty good sport and answering as many questions as he had patience for. Um, and that's, I think that was the start. And the funny thing is, I think it's us adults that get so worried about death and freaked out. And when I've worked with kids programs, nature connection kid programs, and I bring a dead animal, and we skin an animal together, they're just like, there's like zero fear in them. They're just like curious, pure curious, of just like, what's this and what's that, and they're so yeah, there's a real beauty in that, and I definitely remember that. Yeah, I guess it was probably watching fish die, but I don't remember any specific one. But
What do you think of the idea,
yeah,
the old hunter's idea of, oh, fish don't really have feelings. They don't feel it. You've heard that, right?
yeah, of course. I think that's what my dad used to tell me to help me feel better,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah,
Fish
I
don't
just
feel pain.
yeah, exactly. Like,
That
oh
actually
yeah, like,
goes back to, of course, the biblical idea of eating fish is okay, and something I forget. It
oh
says actually in
really?
the Bible, there's something where fish like feel less pain or something like that.
Yeah,
But yeah, it's really interesting to discern between, is this fish dead or is this nerves? And it's always an interesting
yeah.
thing of, you have the old hat of hunting and fishing, etc., which is sort of more on the bare bones, numb to it, and then you have sort of this like feminine awakening aspect of taking a
Mm,
life in order to survive. And I think that's really something that's not communicated well in the hunting community, is there is a really transformative experience that happens. One in Thanksgiving, actually, funny enough, there was actually a roadkill across the street from
mm,
a friend's house that I was staying at, and I brought the deer, and of course we called it in, and I
yeah.
butchered it in front of these 6 or 7 kids, which literally I was off into the corner, and I didn't tell them, I didn't mention it or anything, but they all stood around me with their shirts over their faces, and they couldn't stop watching, and they were so repulsed, but they couldn't stop watching. And there was
Yeah,
no obligation. There was no, like, nobody said, hey, you have to check this out. But literally, they were just completely fixated on the process. And obviously, I think that if we had a culture which taught that at a younger age, we would have a more heart-centered way of approaching it. And of course, we wouldn't see roadkill as just some garbage on the side of the road. We would see it
totally.
as a soul or a life.
Yeah, I love what you said there. More of like kind of bringing the masculine and feminine together. That's what I try to do when I teach. Is there's these two opposite kind of ways of approaching life, and that's kind of where I would say my, excuse me, more modern, more recent goals in hunting have come about is I remember watching my dad handle animal life with a certain callousness.
Mhm.
And I don't, looking back, I'm like, I'm not sure if, I would ask my dad to change anything if he were still alive. But I remember, I don't think I had enough support as a child to watch that and to feel like my heart and feel emotions as that was happening. And so I think my dad said things like, yeah, well, like, oh, it's just a fish, don't worry about it, to help ease my own pain and possibly his. I would assume that that was a belief that helped him. Um, and so, yeah, I think, yeah, there's like the old school, most hunters in this world are like, oh, gruff and rough. I'm going to shoot because I'm going to take, and this is my domain. And, and then there's like kind of the second stage, which is like, I don't want to kill anything, like I don't want to take any life. And
Which
then
is
hopefully we
impossible.
can get to, right, exactly. Hopefully, we can get to this third stage, which is realizing that I am a living creature and that in order for me to live, there must be death.
Yeah.
And agriculture is way more violent than
Mhm.
hunting and being a part of this ecosystem.
Mhm.
And that's where I'm kind of, trying to come at it, which we would say is more, classically indigenous, like, earth connected people knew this, that like, our gratitude and our heart could be so connected to caribou, and we could go and take some caribou, like take the lives of those animals. And I think that's a hard concept for us to a lot of people to swallow. In our modern day thinking is like, well, if you love this thing, you can't kill this thing, and it's like, well, no, the lion loves the gazelle, like,
Mhm.
like they have this beautiful respect for each other. And yeah, and as someone who's even been on the other side of animals hunting me, I had no freaking like hard feelings against the leopard that was stalking me in Africa. It's like, yeah, that's what leopards do, and like that's okay, so yeah, so trying to find that third stage of like, yes, we can kill something and love it and pray for it and respect it and realize how interconnected we are.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it also reminds me that, in this day and age, you have whitetail or red-tailed deer, and although they're said to be overpopulated because we have made suburban
Mm,
sprawl, it's not like there's a giant herd. And if we were hunting as a group towards a herd, we would also have a
mm,
lot more selection capacity as far as looking for a weaker or more damaged animal. And so
totally.
another part that we don't necessarily think about is our ecological function as far as evolving the genome. And so intergenerationally, obviously, when the lion eats the weaker gazelle, it actually
Mm,
helps the collective. And that's one of the things that rubs a weird place because it's almost getting into like eugenics of survival of the
totally.
fittest and how do we make that balance of indigenous people watched an entire herd and actually, the reason, in a way, we became pastoral is because we followed herds.
Mm,
We were
hmm.
wandering with these large herds and eventually culled them. You know,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's a lot of good questions of interconnectedness as we start diving into the wormhole. You're just like, holy crap, everything is so connected. So
yeah.
yeah.
That's what I really appreciate. To go into parts of you were on Naked and Afraid, and I feel like you didn't let them peg you as the new age dreadlocked hippie, which I completely honor. I'm always scared of that kind of like, television angle aspect, but you also
Yeah.
brought a sense of sacredness through what you did. And
Hmm.
I just think a lot of people are really bringing that these days, but it didn't start that way. I went back and saw like Dual Survival. And of course, there was that initial two perspective game. And I think really it's stepped up as far as trying to show, this should hit your heart. If it's not hitting your heart,
Mm,
it's really just as out of balance as going to the grocery store. So I
hmm.
had a pretty random question, which is, have you ever eaten a poisonous mushroom or plant? Have you ever incorrectly eaten the wrong plant or mushroom?
Goodness. I don't I don't think I have.
That's good.
I mean, yeah, that's good. I feel a little embarrassed to admit that I haven't, but
No, you shouldn't feel embarrassed
it's
if the
I
other
mean,
was true.
yeah, I've definitely eaten parts of animals I shouldn't eat. I've eaten gallbladder accidentally before, like forgot to take a gallbladder off of the liver and was like, the most disgusting, vile thing I've ever tasted in my life.
Yeah.
Man, I can't believe I've definitely had a few scares, I'll say that, where I've like kind of been like, oh, this is, I don't know, just like, just pop it in my mouth.
Yeah.
Often when I'm teaching, the ego can get in the way and just be like, oh yeah, I'm so casual. Look how cool I am. And,
Right.
but no, my scares are always, never was the case. It was always
Right.
the thing I thought it was. I just second guessing myself.
So if you were to, the idea of, right, you'll always hear in foraging, I'm a big fan of nibbling and taste testing. And of
Uh-huh.
course, there's always people who will say, well, there's an exception. Poison hemlock actually tastes good. And you're like, have you ever tried it? And they're like, no. So it's like, where are you coming up with that idea in the
Yeah.
first place? And so do you feel like there is a numbing sensation? What are the indicators for you as far as taste being acrid or not safe? And then have you ever kind of experienced that with a plant?
Yeah, I like to really. I'm trying to remember where this came from. This might have come from Matthew Wood, but like thinking of we like to think food and medicine is kind of this black and white thing,
Mhm.
but more so like he does it like a big target. There's like the outermost plants have less medicine, more edibility, right?
Mhm.
So they're like, you could eat a whole meal of strawberries and like there's a little bit of medicine in strawberries, but it's mostly like sugar and food. And then you go in a little bit tighter and it's like, okay, a little bit more intense plants where it's like an onion, like I don't want to eat a whole meal of an onion, which means there's more medicine in it. It's more, food, dosage kind of thing. And then going in even more is like, I don't know, ginger or horseradish or garlic, and then the very middle is like the really intense plants you have to be really careful with because they pack so much of a punch.
Mhm.
Um, so generally when just playing with that, I kind of say like, does it taste like food? Does it smell like food? Does it smell just like super intense, like, aromas or even a feel to it, or smell to it? Like, hemlock will, water hemlock smells like, is it water hemlock or hemlock? I always get those confused, but I don't go and I stop at genus. So you're probably going to scold me for that,
No.
but, but it smells like mouse piss.
Oh,
You,
interesting.
like I've come up, that's always been one thing. I use my nose a lot because I hang out with my dog a lot and I always like sniff a plant first and it'll just smell extremely like urine, like mouse urine. It's just disgusting already. And so I kind of try to listen to my body as much as possible. But yeah, one of my big pet peeves in survival is like people using like phrases and rhymes to remember what they can and can't eat. And I'm like, listen, if you don't have a relationship with this plant, don't go putting it in your damn body, like get to know it, like sit with it, see it for a few seasons, see what it looks like when it's young, see what it looks like when it's old. And once again, it's like, our capitalism or white dominator culture is like take, extract, and people, you probably experience this. I post like something about like a cool sacred plant that I have a relationship with and I made some medicine with it. And then everyone's like, give it to me. I want it. I want it. That's going to be the pill that helps me, So it's a thin line because we want to use plants as allies. But if we're not forming a relationship that creates reciprocity and connection and belonging and respect, then we might just be trying to exploit it for our own benefits.
Right. We can take the same corruption that we see in the capitalist model and apply it to foraging. And that's
Mm-hmm.
so dangerous. And of course, my favorite pet peeve is leaves of three, leave them be, which
Uh-huh.
means that you're scaring children away from eating raspberries, strawberries,
Totally.
leaves of three, leave them be. And,
Yep.
the engagement. And I love that idea. I always tell people that you shouldn't make out with any plant you don't know the first and last name of. So
Oh, nice.
if the Latin name isn't on your tongue, that's a sign that maybe it's time to sit with it more. And of
That's
course, there's
nice.
also the idea in the internet, right? So if I post about chaga, suddenly I'm promoting that everybody needs to take
Right.
chaga, and I'm to shame and blame for promoting
Mm-hmm.
this sacred and rare thing. And I think that's really an unfair perspective. And although we can do our due diligence towards, the caveats, I like chaga, caveat. Don't harvest too much of it. Don't have too much of it. Don't spread it
Totally.
around. Don't sell it for too much money. All the millions and millions of caveats that we have to focus on also boils down to that we need a culture of being a caretaker instead of being exploiters, you know?
Hmm.
So with everything, first of all, it reminds me, obviously, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, should be
Mm,
mandatory education for, you
mm.
know, she should have been the president. She should still be the president. We should just vote for her. And I think she would do a great
2024.
job. Paul Stamets as vice president, you know.
Ooh, I
Yeah,
like this
Mark
ticket. I will
Shepard
vote for
as the
that.
head of Department of Agriculture, you know, as long as we're naming names. Uh, but, you know,
Keep putting it out there.
that would be a sane society as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, the caretaker perspective is so important, and it's something that I think we all, you know, in the age of the internet, it's so easy for somebody to jump on your page and like shame you for not giving enough caveats, but the caretaker perspective is going to take generations to engender, as far instead of, oh, everyone needs the most exotic plant in the whole world. You know,
Hmm.
how can we kind of bridge the gap on, like, wait, we're raising people to be exploiters, and so they go out, and especially I just want to add that apps and Instagram or Facebook groups can be
Hmm.
so dangerous, because literally it could encourage people to just go outside and take pictures of whatever they see and say, can I eat this? Can I eat that? Can I eat that?
Hmm.
Can I eat that?
Hmm.
Can I eat that? And that really is not teaching any sense of brain patterning or education. It's just
Totally.
teaching exploitation.
Yeah.
So,
Like I say this all the time when I teach of like every time I teach you something, it's because I messed up before. I didn't know what I was doing. And so having to undo our brains of like there is an end goal and
mm,
rather it is the journey that forms connection, right? So it's like I can do this with bird language. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, what bird is that?" And I'm like, I don't know, like you're going to have to follow it, aren't you? That sounds like a good riddle. Keep
yeah,
tracking, you know?
yeah, yeah.
And people get upset because they're like, I want the answer. And I'm like, well, do you want the answer and then that's it? Or do you actually want to form a relationship with bird language? And, and then all of a sudden it becomes a very different goal. Um, so yeah, so the struggle or the journey, that is really the rich stuff. It's not, I'm never going to end up, you're never going to end up at the end of knowledge. And there's so much, going back to even simple plants or simple birds, simple. We're always going to find more to unfold and track. So,
You know, it's really interesting as the shifting of perspective to, oh, you are the teacher of foraging, to, no, nature is the teacher. And the
mm,
more questions that you can ask, it's like, oh, I know stinging nettle. It has the stingers. And it's like, well, did you ever look on the underside of the leaf and look at the veins? What? You know, oh, I've seen a robin. It's like, what color are its toenails? You know, what are its
nice. Yeah.
belly feathers like? What is the pupil of its eye color? Like all those things, if I can constantly wander around nature and just fill my head with those kinds of questions, I feel like that is
Hmm.
the unseen teacher. And any teacher is going to hopefully point you in, yeah, you're asking the right question, but I don't want to answer
Hmm.
that. I want you to look at that. What kind of bird
Yeah.
is it? Because it's as soon as the answer comes, it's as if people just close their eyes. You know, okay, now I know it.
Yeah.
Check it off the list.
Boop,
Yep,
done. Totally.
I
Yeah.
see you,
And our
Robin.
roles, yeah, I know Robin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's our role as teachers is to find their edge, their growth edge, where it's like, oh, you do know this. That's great. Good job, and like what's the next step for them?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because it's a lot like political discussion, not to make it political, not to go in that, but as soon as we are tracking, right? Like one of the first rules of tracking is like, don't identify it until the very end, right? Because as soon as you say, oh, that's the answer, right? This is a raccoon track. Okay. Well, then your mind is going to find all the things that prove that right. That's a raccoon track. And so we've destroyed the mystery. Answers destroy mystery. And so that's what happens in politics is like, oh, this is the answer. And then all of a sudden we're only going to look for the information that furthers that. So yeah, I
Maybe we're
remember.
doing that on purpose.
Yeah, and I was gonna say the one time I remember being most humbled it was in a plant class, or I was like, oh yeah, chickweed, I know chickweed, or something pretty common, and my teacher was like, well, can you draw it for me?
Mm.
And I was just like, oh no. It was like start just like green, like this leaf shape, I think, and maybe
Yeah.
this, and it's a very simple, simple plant, but yeah, just the little nuances that we glaze over because we have the answer.
Hmm. We gotta entertain the sense that I don't know anything, even if I've seen it a million times.
The
So I
old
want to dive
old beginner's
into
mind.
some fun ideas of. Um, so as I understand, going on Naked and Afraid, you really don't have any sense of where you're going until pretty much time to go. Is this true, as I've heard?
Plus or minus, I've done it 3 times now and varying degrees of like a little bit of knowledge, but those, even when I had like maybe 2 months of knowledge before, that was rare. That was the most time I've ever had to prepare. And they say things like, hey, Luke, you're going to Namibia. And I'm like, okay, that's like saying I'm going to America. Like, am I going to the north? Am I going to the west? Am I going to the swamp? Am I going to the desert? So, yeah, not a lot of time to prep.
So what is your thoughts like with plants as regard to dropping into somewhere so exotic? What's kind of your process with trying to get a grasp of the plants? I mean, do you just try to brush up on whatever 10 basic utilitarian plants, or are you scrambling to try to figure out your green wall of green where you go?
Yeah. I definitely, when I had time to prepare, I definitely was brushing up on any indigenous knowledge that I could find, So luckily, 2 of my adventures had been in, Southern Africa region. And so books and books and books and books have been written on the Bushmen, the San people, among others, who have, been super well documented, some of the last, like, more true, true hunter gatherers. So study as much as I could. And then you get there and I had like 30 plants in my mind, and I think I found one of the like 30. I was, because it's a desert and it's like you have to know exactly where to go to find this much water and this kind of soil. And it's just, you know, it all comes down to indigenous knowledge, like knowing cultures, years and years and millennia of being in the same place and getting to know these plants. And to try and do it for a survival show is pretty insane. Luckily, one of the ways I teach plants in kind of this most broad sense is like 6 main categories of plants. So like, okay, there are astringent plants, and generally astringents have tannic acid, and they have this compound. There's aromatics, they have a benzene ring, and very, very roughly, those they smell the same or they taste the same because of those chemical constituents. And then those chemical constituents are going to do X, Y, and Z within the body, tighten or moisturize or stimulate. So, just as a few. So I tried to use that as much as I could, just kind of that most, basic fundamental knowledge. And yeah, but I wasn't, like excited to experiment with random plants I didn't know and just like taste them, but a couple times okay, this plant is slimy. It's mucilaginous. Like, great, this is going to be great for my sunburn. Like pretty simple stuff. That yeah does prove to be helpful. And I also remember like eating a whole bunch of wood sorrel in Namibia, and I'm like, I don't think this is a native plant here, but it was everywhere. So white man's footprint.
Yeah. Well, it's also important, and it's a broader concept of really the risk and reward factor of trying to randomly figure your way through plants is actually not going to calorically mean very much. And a lot of
Yeah,
people don't necessarily, they think, oh, I know a couple of plants, and so I could live in nature. And what you're actually doing is you're prolonging starvation. And a lot of people don't think about there are no fats. Well, the debate of amino acids versus proteins, you often hear, oh, kale has protein. I don't really
mm,
like that sentence. I think it has amino acids, which will not necessarily make protein, but there's no
mm-hmm.
fat, there's no calories from greens, so you literally could starve to death eating dandelions, although I love dandelions, but
Sure.
that doesn't represent any calories. So it's a really
Yeah.
important thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, So I was wondering, sort of, if you want to share, and you could select this way as to your experiences. But what is your worst part of Naked and Afraid, and what is maybe a highlight or your best part of Naked and Afraid?
Cool. Yeah. Man, so many experiences, I've spent what 80 some days on Naked and Afraid,
Oh
so
my God,
that's a lot of
what
time. So
perspective? Yeah.
um goodness. My worst, I mean, if we're going like raw like nature elements, the worst is by far the cold at night. Specifically, if, like I didn't have a fire in Namibia for many days, and I was in the high desert, and it would just drop. The temperature would just plummet at night, and you think you know what cold is, like I was like, oh, I prepared for cold, and like, but to be in a desert without, any warmth, without like a shred of clothing just to like drape over you, and like I remember just like shivering, but like not like, oh, my jaw is like my whole body convulsing for like 12 hours a night and staring at the eastern horizon, waiting for the sun to come up, just all night long, like zero sleep, just like, and my body hurt, my head hurt because I was shaking so hard, like for like 10 days straight. Like it was absolutely miserable. Um, yeah, cold is just something we know we have co-evolved with fire, and we're just not we're not so great at dealing with cold. That's our greatest weakness. And when I teach survival, I always say this is our greatest strength, is we are amazing at getting rid of heat. That is like what we're number one at in the whole world. We can run down animals in a marathon in 110-degree heat. No other animal can do that. And that is also our greatest weakness. Our strength is our weakness. That's how nature operates. And so when it gets cold, it doesn't take that much for us to get cold. So that's definitely the worst. Um, the best, goodness. I mean, I think the best is like the feeling of being completely at home in a landscape that you were a stranger to in like, a few weeks before. And I mean, I'm sure that's relative. If I stayed even longer, I'd feel even more at home. But like to be so embodied, to have everything be so direct, like you don't have to think about external things. There was nothing meta about living in the land. There was no like theory. It was like, if I tend my fire, then I'll boil my water, then I'll drink it. Like everything. If I don't hunt, if the animals smell me, then I don't eat, then I'm hungry. Like everything was such a direct chain that I felt like the master of my own landscape, the master of my own being, even if it was misery, or pain or hunger, I was still in charge of it. And there was this like amazing feeling of empowerment and like a lack of anxiety that came from that, where it's just like I'm completely in control of my situation, which I think our world is built the opposite of that, to make us always on edge and always like, no matter what you do or don't do, it might matter, it might not, and you're like gambling every time. So we're just like anxious as hell about our own situation, our own feelings. So, but yeah, to really be in a place and to know the animals and to know the birds and to know their patterns and to eat directly from things you've harvested or killed is like one of the greatest gifts I've ever had as a human, to be able to have that experience.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What did you eat? Bugs? What was your thoughts on bugs? And do you have any thoughts on which are not edible? It's always a hard question. Which bugs, like if you drop it in Namibia or something, how can
Yeah.
you sort of discern what you shouldn't be eating as far as bugs? And did you eat a
That's it.
bunch of
Yeah.
bugs?
I didn't eat a ton of bugs, but I definitely ate some. When I was in Colombia, we ate a good amount of cockroaches and tarantulas and some grubs here and there. I ate some dung beetle grubs, which, you want to guess what they would taste like?
Probably strawberries.
I
At least in your
wish.
mind, when you're eating it, you're thinking of
No,
strawberries.
no, just straight shit. They tasted
Yeah.
like shit
Uh,
because they eat shit. But
you are
who would
what
have
you
thought?
eat.
Yeah, yeah, right. Um, my general rule, I studied wasps for a little bit in college, and we used to say like wasps wanted to eat the things that were hard to find,
Hmm.
and like so if they're really camouflaged, they're probably tasty.
Mm.
right? And if they're like right out in the open and they got plumage all over them, and it's
Yeah.
like they probably don't taste good, so
Yeah.
that's one general rule. Grubs in general are like, you know pretty tasty. They're just like babies, for lack of a better term. They're just like a ball of energy that is going to transform into a different thing. So if you can find grubs, like, that's really nice. um I love eating bugs. I wish I didn't live in a temperate region sometimes, so I could really like pig out on bigger and bigger bugs.
Hmm.
um but as far as animals, bugs not to eat, the big one, yeah, brightly colored. But grasshoppers was one that I did a little research on, where they often have worms in their gut. And I didn't believe that for a while. And I was like, oh, that's just another taboo thing that we say to not eat wild things. But I've witnessed like pulling apart like grasshoppers, and there's like worms, like pretty big
Worms.
ones, like right there. And so I was like, yeah, I don't want to go for those. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the things, even when coming to meat and, like ground beef, for example, I mean, there's a lot that gets through in certain factory farming that people are not aware of. Of course, there's tons of bugs, even in vegan food, such as rice and beans. There's eggs
Mm.
and chopped up bugs. Heinz
Uh-huh.
ketchup has a percentage of flies that is allowed in their ketchup. So we act
Right.
like we are so immune to this phenomenon and can't do it directly. But it's also really interesting because, like, if you want to eat your vegan acorn harvest, you'll often find that you've murdered tons of grubs. And the thing
Totally.
I've been like, well, at least they're garnished on the best food possible. And so acorn
Hmm.
grubs are a little bitter, but they're nice. But hickory grubs are absolutely delicious. And it's sort of a side effect of, harvesting those wild foods. And the funniest part of it is, like, actually one of those grubs is probably the protein equivalent of eating the whole acorn.
Totally. Yeah, it took all the good parts, transformed it for you.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So, one of the thoughts is really, I know that you trained in some wilderness therapy, and I thought it would be really cool to talk about some aspects, maybe parts. How do you get into that? What is the
Hmm.
training like? And if you have any experiences or like inspiration for people who want to get into wilderness therapy, I think that's
Yeah.
a great, endeavor for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the greatest experiences of my life. I love that job. I highly recommend it. Like all things, there's strengths and weaknesses to it. But basically, I was a teacher for a short while. I got my degree in education and with biology, and wanted to be a high school teacher and coach sports. And both my parents were teachers, so I was like, yeah, this is the career I want. And got to that world and was just like so quickly destroyed by the reality of education. And kids would come to me with really serious issues, like, oh, I got my girlfriend pregnant at 14, or I don't know what emotions are, or my dad hit me last night, or whatever, like heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was legally, as their biology teacher, only allowed to help them with biology and only this much biology, like teach what's on the test. So I started looking for a different, I was like, I want to teach, I want to educate, I want to mentor, but I can't do it this way. And so just kind of happened to fall into wilderness therapy out in Utah, where a lot of programs are. There's a lot of programs in Utah, but somewhat all over the country. Um, and the program I worked for happened to be a primitive wilderness, like one of the more primitive programs left in the country. All of them have a different flavor. Some are like adventure based, and you go rock climbing, and you do horse riding or whatever. But this one was literally like every fire we made out in the desert was with sticks, and the kids were in charge of it. And if the kids wanted to use the fire to cook, well, guess what? You got to make a fire every single day. And so you'd be amazed at how fast a hungry teenager can learn the skills and art of fire making. um, so for a long time, I just like loved it. It was full of ceremony. This program I worked with called Outback Therapeutic Expeditions, ceremony and kind of mysticism, really. And yeah, pretty open minded in a lot of ways, and a lot of primitive skills. And so my job became to get it raised. I need to learn more primitive skills, and so I kind of just really got into it. And that combined with like deep wilderness, like out in the middle of nowhere in Utah for weeks, that was a dream. And so I fell in love with it personally, but then I also witnessed these teenagers, at-risk teenagers, 13 to 18, basically like having a number of issues, all be amazingly helped by being out in nature, like completely different humans in a week or two. Like you just like it was really literally like just insane to watch these kids transform. And I was like, I'd like to take credit for me as the teacher, but I really think this is nature doing this. And that's when I dedicated my life to this path of just like, this is the jam for myself, my own body, but also like what this world needs. And so I dedicated my life to like teaching this and trying to find ways to help adults get this as well. And so that's kind of what I've been working towards for a long time. And now I'm kind of, I would say a lot closer to that. Doing my, immersion program with adults now is very much flavored. I sometimes call it wilderness therapy for adults. So, yeah, if people are into it, I mean, there's a number of programs, like I said, out west. There are a few on the East Coast as well. I would just, do a Google search on wilderness therapy, and you don't need a ton of training. They love training people. And the two big things are, if you have outdoor experience, that's great, especially in backcountry. Or if you have experience working with teens. Those are kind of, I used to hire people, and those are kind of the two things we would look for is like, do you have one of those two? You don't need both, but one of those two. And if you're like, so we'd get outdoorsy people that like had never worked with kids, and we're like, cool, here's how to work with kids. And then we'd get people that worked with kids, but weren't really that outdoorsy. It's like, cool, here are the skills for you to like stay safe and warm out in the woods. So yeah, I really, really highly recommend it. It's really beautiful. Some of the downsides are like, it's often like a very expensive program, and it's like pretty affluent families that are able to send their kids to that. But that doesn't make it any less. Those kids are suffering just as much as any other kids. So, yeah. So go for it. Do it.
It kind of reminds me, thank you for sharing it. It reminds me of how you were saying, in your experience in the desert, et cetera, how you're broken down to this baseline of, where's the water coming from? Well, it's up to me. If I don't get up and go get water, I don't drink water. And I think in this culture, it's, Mom, what's for dinner? And I want water, and the bottle comes. And it's just this privileged perspective, and the breaking away of that in any sort of nature-based experience, where now those kids are in a position of like, well, if you don't cook food, you don't eat, and then hunger, and then with your hunger motivates you to change your dietary behaviors and not complain about what you're eating, because you've actually felt the biological sensation of hunger, where usually if you haven't eaten in an hour, you're starving to death because you haven't had M&Ms. And I think the more we can kind of break down and get into, I mean, that's what motivates all of us who are looking to that connection, is that raw biological sense. And I remember in the beginning, you had mentioned that, I forget how you said it, the extremeness of nature. I've never felt more alive when I was in a hammock by myself on the Appalachian Trail in bear country, feeling like a closed-in sardine, and just having no ability to see, knowing that I had smoke around me and hoping that that will help, the smell of smoke, but just feeling like, gosh, if a bear came up to me, I'm stuck in a hammock and I'm like basically a human taco for bears.
Nicely smoked too.
Yeah, a smoked human taco. But that sense of aliveness, that sense of the edge, that sense of almost like enough fear to get you feeling alive, that has been the most healing experiences of my life, and I think that people just need to have that in front of their face.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of saying it. It's just like embodiment. We are motivated by sensations in our body, and if we avoid those sensations, we've numbed ourselves out. We have all these luxuries, so we don't have to feel sensations. That is literally, like gaslighting ourselves of like, we won't trust our emotions, we won't trust how we feel, we won't trust, like we're just so detached from this body and its biological needs. And that's what the program that I worked for was so, adamant about, is natural consequences. So it's like, I'm not an authority, right? It's just like, I mean, I am in some way, because I'm like, oh, you didn't make a fire, so you can't use the fire tonight. I mean, but if there is no fire, then we're all not cooking, like,
Mhm.
and to see the kids would come in the program like, you're the authority, fuck you, and then like it shifts to like, oh well, you didn't make a fire, so I guess I'm eating cold with you too, like I'm suffering with you as well. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're on my team as a staff, and it's just like, this is just life, and these are the natural consequences. So it was really a beautiful way to kind of like Aikido, this authority, this perceived authority out of like, being directed at me as a staff and just into like their own actions and behaviors that have led to this moment.
I love the condensing of cause and effect relationships, and like you're saying, I'm hungry, I got to go figure it out, versus it's all Amazon.com, and then
Mm-hmm.
billion people are involved in that transaction,
Yeah.
and that cause and effect relationship is really what we need to get down to. So we only have a short amount of time now. I wonder if we can restart it. Would you be down for a round two?
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple more questions, and then we could open up to questions from everybody who's watching and see what they say.
Yeah. I'm
So
having a
thank
great
you
time.
for round one.
Real
Really
good.
appreciate you, brother. We'll be
Yeah.
right back with more ranting and raving about nature. See y'all soon.
See ya.